Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1. The Resident in Room 13. The house exhaled metal, a sharp, bitter taste that coated Caleb's throat the second he crossed the threshold. Beneath it lurked something unnamed, something that made his bones feel wrong inside his skin. 3 hours of scorched highway had brought him here, to this Lowe's Angel's hillside where gravity felt different. His shirt stuck to his spine in the foyer's Arctic chill, goosebumps crawling up his forearms despite the desert furnace he'd just escaped. The contradiction gnawed at him. Everything about this place felt like a riddle with missing pieces, though for what they were paying, he'd solve it with his eyes closed. Movement rippled at the staircase's peak. A figure descended from the darkness, each footfall impossibly smooth, liquid. Caleb's mind counted without permission. 13. The number landed heavy in his chest, superstition blooming where logic used to live. When light finally touched her face, his breath caught not at her beauty, but at the exhaustion carved into someone far too young to carry it. 25, maybe, but her eyes had seen decades more. Margaret Sterling. Her voice arrived flat, rehearsed. The handshake lasted half a second, her palm damp, trembling. She yanked it back the instant she realized he'd noticed. When she spoke her husband's name, she pronounced it like a word in a foreign language, technically correct but emotionally distant, lips barely touching the syllables. Caleb's throat constricted. They moved through corridors that defied architecture. Each doorway opened into rooms that couldn't possibly exist within the house's footprint. Spaces folding into spaces, dimensions bleeding into one another. The walls blazed surgical white, so bright they burned his retinas. Floors of some unidentifiable dark timber reflected them as blurred stains rather than clear shapes. In the warped reflection, Caleb looked elongated, distorted. He turned his gaze away before his mirrored self could meet his eyes, with an expression he didn't want to recognize. The conservatory wasn't really a room, more like a glass blister protruding from the western wall, crammed with botanical impossibilities. Cacti thrived beside moisture-starved ferns. Orchids bloomed next to succulents. The laws of nature bent and broke inside this greenhouse cathedral. The air tasted alive, thick and vegetal, forcing Caleb to gulp through his mouth to avoid retching. Conrad Sterling sat motionless in his wheelchair, spine to the entrance, silhouette framed against floor-to-ceiling windows drinking in the dying sun. The chair itself looked predatory, matte black, bristling with medical appendages Caleb couldn't name. Wires and sensors, and a screen mounted on an articulated arm that curved overhead like a scorpion preparing to strike. Blue light pulsed from the monitor, cold and rhythmic. Margaret announced him. The wheelchair pivoted with a mechanical whine that scraped along Caleb's nerve endings. What faced him now had once been attractive, the skeleton of beauty still visible beneath what remained. Handsomeness lurking beneath the wreckage. Half his face hung lifeless, muscles surrendered to gravity, sagging like melted wax. The other half retained just enough control to twist his lips into a perpetual snarl. But his eyes, both eyes, tracked Caleb with surgical precision, intelligence sharpened to a blade's edge, flaying him open layer by layer. Then it happened. A fracture in the mask. For less than a heartbeat, those eyes exploded wide. The expression beneath the snarl contorted into raw desperation, the look of someone submerged, lungs burning, watching a lifeboat drift just beyond their fingertips. Terror, begging, something clawing to break free. Then nothing. The coldness slammed back into place. Caleb convinced himself it was neurological misfiring. Disease echoes. Sunset distortion through the greenhouse glass playing tricks on shadow and bone. The monitor flashed. A voice materialized from nowhere and everywhere at once. Synthetic, neutered, mechanically male, only because someone had programmed it that way. The first syllable glitched. Why you? A digital seizure before self-correction. You're 20 minutes late. The voice moved like someone navigating a foreign alphabet, each word assembled rather than spoken, grammar feeling its way through darkness. When Caleb opened his mouth to explain the navigation failure, the voice sliced through him with newfound authority. It had zero interest in his GPS. What mattered was obedience. Could he follow simple directions or not? The sound originated from speakers embedded in the wheelchair's headrest, but Caleb's eyes drifted downward to Sterling's throat, motionless when the voice performed, to the wetness glistening at the paralyzed corner of his mouth where drool escaped biology's control. Fresh moisture, recently wiped. Margot's work, probably. Caleb pictured her performing that tender maintenance, the terrible intimacy of it, and nausea bloomed in his gut. I can follow instructions, Caleb managed. The screen blinked its verdict, we'll see. Margot's fingers found his elbow, ice through cotton, steering him toward the exit. Her words arrived in careful sequence. Dinner at 7, Conrad's nutrition delivered intravenously. She'd welcome the conversation. Behind them, the wheelchair rotated back toward the windows. The servo mechanism released a high-pitched mechanical whine that vibrated through Caleb's jawbone, a frequency engineered for maximum irritation. He wondered if Sterling had selected that exact pitch on purpose, if the disease had stolen everything except his ability to inflict minor torments. The guest house crouched at the property's furthest edge, tethered to the main. A covered walkway stretched between the guest house and the mansion, and along its 50-foot spine, 6 security cameras hung like predators. Caleb counted each one. Their lenses gleamed wet and black, the eyes of something that lived where sunlight died. The guest house interior put his old life to shame. 3 months ago, he'd lost his apartment when the credit card vultures stopped accepting scraps. Now he stood in a space twice that size, staring at a bed built for royalty and pillows that felt like compressed clouds. The shower attacked him with pressure bordering on violence. He let the water scald his skin crimson, trying to drown the greenhouse stench still clinging to his sinuses. It refused to leave. It had burrowed deeper than water could reach. By 6:45, he returned to the main house. Margot waited in a dining hall designed for a dozen guests, but only 2 settings occupied one corner, a deliberate showcase of absence, loneliness given physical form. She changed into evening where that looked like punishment, black fabric that swallowed light instead of reflecting it. Up close, the evidence revealed itself. Crimson-rimmed eyes, swollen tissue beneath them, the aftermath of tears shed in private. Conrad wouldn't be dining with them, she explained. He preferred observation from his quarters. Her hand drifted upward, directing Caleb's attention to the ceiling corner where a camera lens rotated with a soft mechanical click, locking onto both of them. Watching, recording, judging. They consumed salmon drowning in sauce that couldn't hide its flavorlessness. Vegetables cooked into submission, texture erased. Margot performed surgery on her plate, cutting, repositioning, never actually eating. 3 glasses of wine vanished while Caleb nursed his first. Silence expanded between them until it became solid, a phantom guest at the empty chairs, breathing their air. How long have you been married? Caleb's voice cracked the quiet because the alternative was suffocation. Margot's fork froze mid-journey. She lowered it with ceremonial precision, aligning it against her plate's edge like a sacred ritual. 6 years, this August. Then came the medical terminology. Progressive autonomic failure, degenerative, terminal, 6 months remaining, possibly fewer. The doctors had measured out his dying in weeks and days. Caleb delivered the expected condolences. "Don't be sorry." Her eyes lifted, meeting his for the first time since they'd sat down. What Caleb saw there made his instincts scream to retreat, to create physical distance. Attraction, yes, but beneath it something far more disturbing. Desperation, like drowning, like someone already underwater watching the surface recede. She opened her mouth, words forming about how Conrad had ceased being the man she married, how that version died when paralysis claimed him, how the thing in the wheelchair now was something else entirely, something that observed and calculated and waited for purposes she couldn't fathom. Then she stopped herself, pressed, her mouth into a bloodless line, color draining from her lips as they compressed. An apology tumbled out for the wine, for speaking truths that should stay buried. Above them, the camera lens whispered its adjustment. Back in the guest house, distance felt both infinite and suffocating. Caleb collapsed onto the excessive mattress, staring into darkness, ears straining against sounds that defied identification. Electrical frequencies humming beneath perception. Music bleeding through walls from nowhere. Rhythmic creaking that could be footsteps or could be his paranoia manufacturing threats from silence. Sleep arrived in shattered pieces. Nightmares bleeding into half-consciousness. Rest that repaired nothing. Morning found Sterling relocated to a different chamber. This one sterile white, equipped with parallel bars and resistance machinery that belonged in a rehabilitation center. The old man's gaze latched onto Caleb the instant he crossed the threshold. The monitor blazed awake, instructions scrolling in synthetic speech. Range of motion exercises. Legs, arms, shoulders. Despite the disease attacking nerves rather than tissue, the muscles were surrendering to atrophy. Sterling wanted to preserve whatever scraps of dignity his body still possessed. Caleb understood dignity's erosion intimately. The past year had stripped his down to bone. First, the clinic collapsed under its own failed promises. Then the lawsuits multiplied. Patients who'd mortgaged hope on treatments insurance corporations refused to acknowledge. The apartment evaporated. The car repossessed. Finally, the girlfriend, who'd endured longer than logic suggested but abandoned before Caleb actually needed her. But Mrs. Miller, she haunted him differently. 73 years old, paying cash for Sessions' Medicare classified as non-essential because she promised herself she'd dance at her granddaughter's wedding. The stroke hit mid-treatment, right there on his table, her face crumpling as her brain short-circuited. Her daughter's screams in the hospital corridor still echoed in Caleb's skull. You killed her with lies. You sold her false hope, and it murdered her. Mrs. Miller survived. Never walked, never forgave. The malpractice case dissolved, but the medical board review didn't. Now his license existed in provisional purgatory, a scarlet letter that made employers scatter. Sterling had been the only callback, the only one desperate or calculating enough to hire damaged goods. Caleb's fingers made contact with Sterling's leg and cold, radiated through the fabric barrier, flesh already transitioning into something barely qualifying as living tissue, muscle dissolving into memory. The work demanded mechanical precision and invasive intimacy that made revulsion crawl beneath Caleb's skin. Lifting, rotating, stretching, manipulating limbs while those unblinking eyes dissected him with surgical focus. The screen periodically interrupted with criticism. Angle incorrect, insufficient pressure, duration inadequate. Caleb recalibrated, continued. The air conditioning maintained exactly 68 degrees. Yet perspiration pooled between his shoulder blades, gathered in the hollow where his throat met his chest. The session concluded. Sterling's monitor extinguished without ceremony. No dismissal, no acknowledgement. Caleb lowered the final limb onto the footrest and retreated a step, anticipating instructions that never materialized. Those eyes refused to release him. He counted seconds, 30, 40, then pivoted and escaped because another moment would shatter whatever composure he had left intact. The kitchen materialized around him like a stage set. Margaret stood before a coffee machine that resembled laboratory equipment more than appliance, all glass chambers and chrome precision. She poured without consultation, as if his presence demanded caffeine. He accepted the scalding cup because his trembling hands required occupation. "How did it go?" Her voice floated careful. "Fine." The lie landed between them, obvious and uncontested. "Let's take these to the pool." He trailed her through yet another labyrinth of rooms that seemed to shift their geometry when his attention wandered, spatial logic collapsing and reforming, until they burst onto stone surrounding water so violently blue it screamed chemical intervention. Artificial, like everything else rotting beneath this mansion's perfect surface. Their chairs faced away from the house, oriented toward scrub-covered hills clawing at the sky. Margaret outlined the schedule. Therapy at sunrise, lunch at midday, afternoons liberated, dinner at 7, nights isolated in the guest house unless she needed him. That final phrase arrived weighted, deliberate. She studied his face for recognition, while Caleb felt the implications pressure without grasping its exact dimensions. The days collapsed into rhythm, the kind that mimics drowning in decelerated motion. Every dawn, Caleb manipulated Sterling's abandoned anatomy, while the synthesized voice dissected his technique. Every afternoon, he barricaded himself in the guest house, trying not to catalog the visible cameras or imagine the concealed ones. Every evening, he performed dinner theater with Margaret beneath Sterling's electronic surveillance. Every night, he lay rigid, parsing sounds that violated physical law yet persisted anyway. Night 3 brought Margaret to his door. 11 o'clock, wine bottle, 2 glasses, do you mind? He minded profoundly. Let her inside regardless, because acknowledging fear meant surrendering to it, and he wasn't prepared for that confession. They occupied his cramped patio, enveloped by pool machinery's mechanical respiration and landscape lights humming their electric lullaby. She excavated her history before Conrad materialized to rewrite it. Prague, fashion photography, an accident that carved permanent damage across her abdomen, terminating everything she'd built. Then Sterling, delivering a keynote at some medical technology summit about neural interfaces while she staffed the registration desk. He invited her to dinner. 6 months dissolved. Marriage followed. She recounted it like someone describing. A car crash, inevitable physics, no preventable outcome. Wine loosened her boundaries. She invaded his space when speaking, fingers landing on his forearm for emphasis, laughter erupting at statements devoid of humor. Caleb felt his body betraying his judgment, responding despite every alarm shrieking warnings, despite cameras recording from shadows, despite the wrongness saturating every molecule of this arrangement. Night 5, she kissed him. He permitted it for 3 heartbeats before retreat, reality crashing back. This woman belonged to his employer. He needed this paycheck to survive. Surveillance documented everything. Her smile arrived sad and knowing, transforming him into a naive child who believed cameras constituted obstacles. He's aware, her voice stayed level, factual. He orchestrates this. He desires my happiness. The way happiness left her mouth made it sound like terminal diagnosis. Night 7. She guided him into the main house past midnight, navigating darkness through corridors he'd never traversed. A library materialized, walls lined with books too pristine for reading, spines uncreased, pages virgin white. She extracted scotch from crystal, poured doubles, then spoke words that restructured reality. Lucid architecture. A meditation framework Conrad engineered. She elaborated. Technology for projecting awareness beyond biological imprisonment, constructing mental landscapes where paralysis dissolved, where the caged could experience liberation. Sterling had mastered it as his body transformed into a cage, recognizing the flesh as enemy. He transmitted the knowledge to Margaret as compensation, survival tools for someone drowning in caretaker isolation. She demonstrated. Cross-legged on leather, eyelids descending, breath following geometric patterns engineered to fracture consciousness. 4-count inhalation, 7-count suspension, 8-count release. Repeat. Mechanical, hypnotic. 5 minutes elapsed. Her head collapsed forward, respiration slowing until Caleb questioned whether oxygen still reached her lungs. Then she screamed. Caleb lunged, but her eyes detonated open before contact, and suddenly she was laughing, gasping, electric, radiating vitality he'd never witnessed in her before. I stood behind you, she panted between laughter. Touched your shoulder. You couldn't register it, present but absent. Do you comprehend? He comprehended nothing. More scotch, deeper explanation. The technique demanded severing bodily sensation until consciousness detached from its biological anchor, free to navigate space unencumbered by meat and limitation. Sterling had charted the neurology, refined the meditation into repeatable science. It functioned, she swore. She outlined the mechanics with surgical precision, each rule a warning disguised as instruction. Projected consciousness existed invisible to flesh-bound observers, imperceptible except as inexplicable cold spots, electromagnetic anomalies that made hair stand vertical. But concentration could solidify the ephemeral. With practice, a consciousness untethered from meat could materialize itself into something visible, even tactile enough to disturb physical reality, though the energy cost bordered catastrophic. Conrad perceived them during projection, she clarified, exclusively because he dedicated years to perfecting the architecture. To everyone else, they'd register as ghosts haunting a world too distracted to notice. The genuine threat, she continued, emerged from overstaying your separation. The tether binding awareness to biology could elongate, fray. Venture too distant from your abandoned shell or linger disembodied beyond critical hours, and reintegration became nightmare. Worse, if foreign consciousness discovered your vacant form during absence, occupation proved simpler than projection. A body lacking its native inhabitant became territory begging for colonization. Never project solo, she emphasized, intensity sharpening her features. Always station someone guarding your flesh, protecting the vessel while you wander. Caleb tried dismissing it as elaborate lucid dreaming, sophisticated dissociation, given mystical terminology. Her head snapped sideways, impatience radiating something almost predatory. Experience it yourself, not invitation, command. Her tone made refusal biologically impossible. She coached him through respiratory geometry, systematic muscular surrender, visualization techniques for perceiving his identity as independent from anatomy. The scotch either facilitated or sabotaged the process. Clarity had abandoned him. His sense of self became liquid, impossible to grasp, and the library's architecture started warping, edges melting into geometries that shouldn't coexist. Then displacement. He stood adjacent to the sofa, staring downward at himself, still seated, eyelids sealed, skull reclined against leather. His body, the meat that housed him, except now it resembled abandoned real estate, a structure he'd vacated. The chest rose and fell, automatic, empty. He lifted his hand experimentally. It penetrated the coffee table like smoke passing through smoke, two substances occupying identical space without collision. Margit materialized beside him, or rather, her projection materialized, wearing a smile that bordered on evangelical fervor. She gestured, "Follow." They passed directly through the library wall into the corridor beyond, as if solid matter had been optional all along. The mansion transformed from this vantage point, expanded. The walls vibrated with electrical currents he could perceive without hearing, wiring concealed behind plaster revealing itself as luminous networks, pulsing rhythmically with his phantom heartbeat that no longer existed. They ascended stairs that warped beneath non-existent feet, shifting through dimensions that defied vocabulary, and surfaced in a hallway populated with doors his waking eyes had never catalogued. The corridor stretched before them, and without a word, though the air had already turned thick with unspoken agreement, she came to a halt. Her hand rose, a single finger extended toward a sealed entryway, and something shifted in Caleb's awareness. He didn't need her to open it. If he narrowed his focus, sharpened his intent, the barrier dissolved. Wood became vapor. Darkness peeled back. And there, in the glow of flickering screens, sat Conrad Sterling. His wheelchair faced a wall of monitors. Every corner of the estate flickered across the glass, rooms, corridors, the underwater glow of the pool cutting through the night. On one screen, Caleb saw his own form, slumped in the library chair, chest rising and falling in slow, mechanical rhythm. On another, her body lay motionless on the couch, limbs arranged like a discarded marionette. Sterling's hands rested on the armrests, lifeless. His face sagged, drained of expression, but his eyes, those eyes were awake. They tracked the screens with a focus that felt wrong, too precise, too empty. Not human, more like a surveillance system running diagnostics. She pulled him away before he could process it fully, leading him down another hall, through another door. This room belonged to her. He recognized the gown from dinner draped over the closet, the row of glass bottles lined along the vanity. She motioned toward the bed, and he obeyed, lowering himself carefully. His hand sank through the mattress at first, a jarring lurch, until he learned to adjust, to solidify just enough to rest on the surface without disappearing into it. She settled beside him. Here, in this untethered state, contact was different. Less flesh, more echo. A sensation remembered rather than felt. When her lips met his, it was like brushing against a live wire, like tasting the air before lightning splits the sky. He leaned in, not because his body urged him to, but because without it, fear had no grip. Without weight, doubt dissolved. When they finally returned, slipping back into skin and bone like sliding into cold water, his lungs seized. A violent gasp ripped through him. His pulse slammed against his ribs, wild and uneven. Every inch of him felt scorched, oversensitive, brand new. She reached across the space between them and closed her fingers around his. The contact was startling, shockingly solid after the ghost of what they'd just shared. "Now you see it," she whispered. And he did, or believed he did. He understood why she craved this, why leaving her body was the only reprieve she had from the cage of her life. He understood the weight of what she'd given him, this secret, this intimacy that ran deeper than anything flesh could offer. He understood that he wanted to return to it, even as every logical corner of his newly inhabited mind screamed warnings. So they did. Night after night it became their rhythm, wine in his quarters until the clock struck 12. Then the quiet walk through shadowed halls to the library. Then the breathwork, the release, the separation. And then freedom. They moved through the house in ways a body never could. They passed through solid matter, walls, locked entryways, barriers that would have stopped them before. They rose to the ceiling, suspended, looking down at rooms from vantage points that warped perspective, that made familiar spaces feel alien and vast. The monitoring room became a place they returned to again and again. Hovering just beyond the threshold, weightless, they'd observe him observing them, an endless loop of watching and being watched. Caleb couldn't look away from the old man's unnatural stillness, the way his eyelids never fell, the barely perceptible twitch of a single finger against the wheelchair's console. That finger was the only part of him that still obeyed. On the 14th night, she brought him somewhere new, Sterling's bedroom. The space felt more like a medical wing than a place to sleep. A hospital bed dominated the center, flanked by machinery, monitors beeping softly, an IV pole, cylinders of oxygen lined against the wall. But what stopped Caleb cold was the gallery covering one entire side of the room. Photographs, dozens of them, a timeline in frames. In the earliest images, Sterling stood upright, broad-shouldered, commanding. The people around him leaned in, their postures bent toward deference. As the years progressed, subtle changes crept in: a crooked smile, a cane gripped too tightly, a gauntness creeping into his frame. Then came the later ones, the ones that mattered. Sterling confined to the chair, Margaret beside him at fundraisers, conferences, intimate dinners. In every single shot, she looked smaller. Not just physically, but diminished in some fundamental way, as though proximity to the wheelchair siphoned something vital out of her. She pointed to one image in particular. His hand rested on her shoulder, one finger extended. It could have been tenderness, or it could have been possession, a brand, a claim. Then she showed him what she'd uncovered during their wanderings. Papers, legal documents hidden in Sterling's desk, a will recently amended. Upon his death, his empire, $300 million, would be funneled into a charitable trust. Neurological research. Margaret's name appeared only once in a footnote. A monthly allowance, barely enough to cover rent in a mediocre neighborhood. The air seemed to thicken around him. The pieces he'd been avoiding, the ones scattered at the edges of his vision, suddenly locked together with brutal clarity. 6 years. She'd given him 6 years. Her 20s consumed by this, caring for a body that was failing, enduring the scrutiny, the isolation, the suffocating routine of keeping him alive. And when it ended, she'd walk away with nothing. 32 years old, no career, no safety net, no future. "There's more," she said. Her voice had flattened, stripped of inflection. She told him about the medication Sterling took, the precise cocktail that kept his heart beating, his lungs functioning. She began listing the prescriptions, the exact combinations, the precise milligrams that kept his failing system operational. Then she moved to what could undo it all, the triggers buried in his condition. A surge of adrenaline, a spike of terror. Anything that flooded his veins too fast would overwhelm a nervous system already crumbling from the inside out. His body was a house of cards. One strong gust and it would collapse. But there was more. She'd found correspondence, messages to his lawyer about end-of-life options, research into nations where choosing your own exit was permitted, detailed preparations. Except the threads didn't weave toward peace. They pointed toward something uglier, a design to make it look like her fault, to ensure she'd face prosecution while being erased from the inheritance entirely. He didn't just want to die. He wanted to destroy her on the way out, punishment for still breathing while he decomposed in that chair, for staying young and alive while he withered. And then came the revelation that made everything else feel small. For years, he'd been bleeding the company dry, funneling fortunes into digital wallets, anonymous accounts scattered across Singapore and island tax havens, webs of financial architecture so intricate even his own legal team had no idea they existed. Hundreds of millions, maybe more. Money that would never surface in probate because, officially, it had never belonged to him. She'd stumbled onto the proof buried in encrypted servers, strings of access codes, wallet keys, account sequences. Enough wealth to fund a dozen lifetimes in absolute luxury. When his heart stopped, all of it would evaporate, lost forever to anyone without those fragments of information. Caleb wanted to reject it, to convince himself she was delusional, manipulative, spinning fiction to justify something unforgivable. But he'd stared into Sterling's eyes through those monitors. He'd felt the cold hatred emanating from that motionless shell. He'd lived inside the suffocating design of this house, built not to shelter, but to trap. Her voice cut through the silence. We could terrify him. The words landed with surgical precision, each one deliberate, rehearsed. Show ourselves to him when he's alone. Manifest as something he can't explain. His system wouldn't survive the shock. No wounds, no signs of struggle, just an elderly man succumbing to the illness that was already killing him. The coroner would sign off without hesitation. In the projection state, untethered, weightless, floating, everything had felt permitted. Freed from flesh, Caleb had acted without hesitation, felt without shame, crossed lines his physical self would have recoiled from. Being unmoored erased accountability. It dissolved the gravity of consequence. But this wasn't that. This was different. They were here, fully present, hearts beating in their chests, discussing the deliberate ending of a human life. He should have stopped it, should have stood up, left the estate, disappeared before this spiral dragged him under completely. Instead, he heard his own voice ask how they'd do it. The question hung between them. How would Sterling even perceive them? Would they remain ghosts, invisible specters hovering just beyond his awareness? She had an answer. He trained her in methods to push past the veil. With enough focus, enough raw intention, a projection could distort the electromagnetic field around it, bend light, cast shadows where nothing solid existed, create the visceral sense of something present, something wrong. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be enough. Then came the calculations. His medication regimen left windows of vulnerability. Between 2 and 4 in the morning, his autonomic systems ran on fumes, heart rate irregular, blood pressure unstable. That's when they'd strike. They debated what form to take, what degree of visibility they could sustain, how many seconds of sustained terror it would require before his cardiac system gave out entirely. They mapped it like architects planning a renovation, like travelers arranging an itinerary. The detachment was staggering, almost incomprehensible. but it also felt like the only sane response to the grotesque machinery Sterling had built around them. 3 nights passed. Caleb lay motionless in the guest house, breathing in measured intervals, feeling the edges of himself begin to blur. Moonlight spilled through the window, draining color from the world, leaving only gradients of shadow and pale silver. His mind wandered to the collection notices stacked on his kitchen counter, the eviction warning taped to his door, the metallic taste of donated canned goods he'd survived on for weeks. He thought about Mrs. Miller's granddaughter in a white dress, walking down an aisle without the woman who'd raised her. He thought about the email from the medical board, his provisional license under review again, another 6 months of limbo. He thought about his ex-girlfriend's face the last time they'd spoken. No rage, just pity. That look had cut deeper than any accusation could. He thought about Margot's shaking hands, Sterling's surveillance dead stare, $300 million and the life it promised. Not wealth for wealth's sake, but liberation. Freedom from the machinery designed to grind people like him into dust. Escape from being the man who'd let Mrs. Miller down, who'd failed everyone who'd placed faith in him. He turned these thoughts over and over until they lost shape, until cognition dissolved, until he found himself standing upright, gazing down at his own chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. She appeared beside him, not arriving, just suddenly there, the way objects exist in dreams without explanation. Her hand found his. Even here, untethered, her grip felt ice cold, desperate. They passed through the guest house wall like smoke through screen, across the lawn where darkness pooled thick and absolute, through the exterior of the main residence, into the grand entrance hall. The house transformed after midnight. Security cameras pivoted on their joints, sweeping across empty space, following movements they couldn't truly register, a pantomime of vigilance. The atmosphere felt electrified, humming with invisible voltage. They began to ascend. They drifted upward through the stairwell into the second-floor corridor. Each step toward Sterling's quarters made Caleb feel thinner, more translucent. Terror did that, he was learning. Emotion burned through concentration, made holding form exponentially harder. He clenched his will, forcing himself to solidify, reminding himself why they'd crossed this line. The door stood shut. They melted through it. Sterling sat facing the window, his back to the entrance, exactly as he appeared on the monitors night after night. The only illumination came from the screens embedded in his wheelchair's control panel, cold blue radiance that warped the shadows, made them twist in directions that defied geometry. She positioned herself directly in his sightline, just inside his peripheral field. Then she began the work of pulling herself into the visible spectrum. Caleb watched her grow denser, more tangible, her outline sharpening until she cast a dim silhouette against the far wall. Sterling's eyes shifted, tracking toward her. His pupil expanded, swallowing the iris. The monitors embedded in his chair lit up with data, heart rate spiking, blood pressure climbing into dangerous territory. It was working. God help them, it was actually working. Caleb circled to the opposite side, summoning every ounce of focus he had left. His projection thickened, coalesced. He raised his hand toward Sterling's face, fingers outstretched, watching his own flesh materialize in the monitor's pale glow. And then he saw them. Tears. Sterling's face was soaked. Wet tracks caught the light streaming from both eyes, the living one and the paralyzed one, weeping with an intensity that should have required muscle control he no longer had. The moisture pooled in the slack corner of his mouth, mixing with saliva, carving paths down his chin, soaking into the fabric over his chest. The eyes that had tracked Caleb with such cold calculation on his first day here now held something entirely different. Not cruelty, not malice. Raw, suffocating terror. The kind he'd glimpsed for a fraction of a second in the garden room. Not Sterling's fear, someone else's. Someone trapped inside, screaming behind a face that could no longer scream. The screen on the wheelchair's mechanical arm flared to life. A single word appeared, repeated, over and over, filling the display with frantic iteration. Run, 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 run. The synthesizer activated, speaking the word in its lifeless monotone. But underneath the digital veneer, Caleb heard something else. A wetness. A human quality the machine shouldn't have been capable of producing. The word sounded like drowning. Run, run, run. Caleb's form flickered, destabilizing. He turned toward Margot's manifested shape, saw her. Expression twisted into something foreign, a smile that belonged to someone else entirely, too sharp, too victorious, too calculated to have ever lived on the face of the woman he thought he'd known. The truth crashed through him like an avalanche of frozen glass. The projection worked. The consciousness transfer was real. Sterling had pioneered it, mastered it, taught his wife every nuance of the technique. And Sterling, brilliant, ruthless, staring down 6 months of life, would never have remained imprisoned in decaying flesh once he discovered the escape route. The body in the wheelchair wasn't Sterling. It was Margot. The real Margot, locked inside her husband's paralyzed shell, voiceless except for the synthesized monotone, immobile except for the single finger required to navigate the chair's controls. Helpless to do anything but observe through those monitors as her husband, draped in her stolen body like a predator in costume, seduced the architect, orchestrated her own execution. She'd watched everything. Every night they'd projected through these halls, invisible to Caleb but in perfect view to her. Two phantoms plotting her destruction while she sat 3 feet away, screaming silently into the void. She'd witnessed every touch, every kiss, every whispered strategy, powerless to intervene until now, until Caleb had pulled himself visible enough for her to reach him with the only tool she had left. The projection wearing Margot's face, Sterling's consciousness, smiled wider. She extended her hand toward the wheelchair, and Caleb watched her fingers sink through the armrest, manipulating something hidden in the mechanism below. A plunger descended on the IV line. Transparent fluid surged through the tubing. The body convulsed. The real Margot, imprisoned in Sterling's dying frame, receiving the lethal dose designed to mimic natural cardiac failure. Unable to scream except through the digital voice still cycling its desperate plea. Run, 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 each repetition degrading, distorting, dissolving into static. Caleb lunged forward, but his projection had no substance, no grip on physical matter beyond the faint electromagnetic shimmer he could generate. He tried to snap back to his body, to jolt awake, to summon help before it was too late. But projection didn't work that way. He'd wandered too far, stayed untethered too many nights, exploring too deeply. The connection to his sleeping flesh had stretched to gossamer, a thread worn so thin it could no longer reel him home. He fled anyway, tearing through walls, floors, ceilings, racing toward the guest house, desperate to find his way back before the link severed completely. The hallways warped, extended impossibly, walls bent at angles that violated reason. Distance stopped making sense, became fluid and unreliable. He was sprinting through a dimension that existed only in thought, a realm governed by laws he couldn't begin to comprehend. When he finally burst into his room, his body was upright, awake, and it was smiling. Sterling stared out from behind Caleb's eyes, radiating absolute triumph. Caleb could only watch as his own hand reached toward the nightstand, fingers closing around an object he couldn't quite identify. He watched himself rise to his feet and stride toward the exit with a confidence he hadn't felt in months, not since the financial collapse had gutted him from the inside out. He tried to cry out, but a projection has no vocal cords. He lunged for his body, desperate to force his way back in, but Sterling had barricaded the entrance, occupied every inch of physical space, sealed him out completely. He was adrift now, consciousness without a vessel, a mind unmoored. Sterling, piloting Caleb's flesh, moved through the estate with purpose. Caleb trailed behind, powerless, watching his stolen body navigate with a fluidity and certainty he'd never achieved himself. Sterling understood this form better than he did, had studied it across months of therapy sessions, cataloging every gesture, every posture, every micro-expression until he could replicate them flawlessly. He watched himself enter Sterling's bedroom, approach the wheelchair. The real Margaret was gone, her face locked in a mask of absolute terror, the text-to-speech display still cycling endlessly. Run, 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 run. Sterling, wearing Caleb's skin, opened a drawer and extracted another syringe. He prepared it with clinical efficiency, drawing amber liquid from a vial. He moved toward the body that had once housed Margaret, the shell that now contained nothing. Her consciousness had evaporated when the flesh expired, or perhaps it lingered somewhere beyond Caleb's perception, trapped in a dimension he couldn't access. The needle pierced the corpse's arm. Then Sterling began arranging the tableau, positioning the wheelchair just so, adjusting the angle of the hands, placing the empty syringe on the floor with deliberate care, crafting a scene that told a specific story. Exhausted wife administers a fatal dose to her suffering husband, then turns the same mercy on herself. Murder-suicide, a narrative everyone would accept without question, because everyone understood how caregiving destroyed people, how devotion curdled into suffocating obligation, how compassion could twist into a final, desperate act of release. Caleb's projection surged forward, trying to knock the syringe from view, to shove Sterling, to leave any trace of a third presence. But he was vapor, immaterial, incapable of touching the world he once inhabited. He was a ghost, watching his own life end in real time. Sterling, inside Caleb's stolen skin, glanced at his wrist. Caleb witnessed his own hand perform the motion, watched his fingers drum against the watch crystal, a tic he'd developed during the relentless phone calls from creditors. Sterling had absorbed it perfectly. Then he dialed emergency services from Caleb's phone. The voice that emerged, Caleb's voice, identical down to the smallest inflection, cracked with manufactured panic as he reported discovering both Mr. and Mrs. Sterling deceased. Possible overdose. He pleaded for immediate assistance, delivered the address with shaking precision, remained on the line until the dispatcher confirmed units were en route. He ended the call and lowered himself to the bed's edge. Caleb's body folded into a posture of devastation that looked utterly genuine. Head buried in palms, shoulders convulsing as though racked with sobs, but Caleb could see the truth, no moisture, no tears. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Emergency lights began pulsing through the windows, scarlet and sapphire strobes painting the walls. Caleb's projection began unraveling, He could feel himself coming apart, consciousness splintering without flesh to tether it. He fought to maintain cohesion, but awareness slipped through him like sand, like fog, like the final exhale escaping a corpse. The last image before he dissolved, Sterling answering the door in his body, delivering a flawless performance of traumatized shock, describing how he'd woken needing the restroom, noticed lights blazing in the main residence, discovered them both lifeless. What a horrific tragedy. He'd only been employed here 2 weeks, but they'd seemed so devoted despite Mr. Sterling's condition. The authorities absorbed every word. Naturally, why would they question him? A distraught employee reporting a terrible discovery. The narrative fit too cleanly. Caleb tried to shriek a warning, but thought without vocal cords produces no sound. He attempted to pull himself visible, to appear before them as proof, but he'd exhausted his capacity for manifestation in Sterling's bedroom, drained his ability to touch reality. He came apart. Not death in the traditional sense. Death required having been alive in flesh and bone, but an ending all the same. Consciousness shattering into fragments, memory bleeding into the electromagnetic currents humming through the house's circuitry, identity dissolving into static, into interference, into noise. A ghost trapped in the machine, presence without purpose, just haunting. The estate on the Lowe's Angels hillside sat vacant now, held by a charitable trust paralyzed by indecision. The pool water turned opaque and algae thick. The garden room's vegetation either withered or exploded into wild growth, following no pattern. The surveillance cameras continued their mechanical rotations, observing emptiness. Occasionally, a young man who resembled Caleb but carried himself with the bearing of someone decades older would navigate the access road and idle in his vehicle, gazing at the structure. He'd remain there for hours, watching shadows deepen as daylight bled away, until motion sensors triggered the interior lighting, room after room illuminating vacancy. Then he'd depart in a vehicle far superior to anything Caleb could have afforded, returning to an existence far richer than Caleb had ever tasted, abandoning the specter to wander through barriers and mourn the sensation of oxygen-filling lungs. The estate carried a scent that had never been right. From the very first breath, something had been poisoned in the air. Caleb understood now, in his formless state, drifting through corridors he could no longer escape. The house had been screaming warnings from the beginning. He simply hadn't known how to listen. Story 2, The Milk Glass. The sun knew exactly where to strike. Every morning the same angle, the same blinding shard of light knifing through the landing window just as Ruth reached the 7th step, tray balanced in trembling hands. Every morning the same stumble, the same recovery, the same climb toward the bedroom that faced the rising light. This pattern would repeat until death intervened, hers or the old woman's. The question was only which would come first. The tray carried the same cargo it always did. Eggs cooked until the yolk collapsed at the slightest pressure, toast trimmed of every trace of crust, a glass of milk still radiating cold from the icebox. Everything soft, everything easy to swallow. The grandmother's throat could no longer manage anything with texture, with resistance. She couldn't feed herself anymore, couldn't rise from the bed, couldn't dress without assistance, could barely rotate her skull against the pillow where it had been sinking for nearly 2 years, according to the physician's last assessment 3 months prior. Ruth's hands had started shaking recently. She'd first noticed it while pouring coffee, the stream wavering, missing the cup's center. Then while fastening the children's clothing, her fingers fumbling with buttons that should have been automatic. Now the tremor announced itself every time she lifted the tray. China clattered. The milk shivered inside its glass surface, rippling. 3 days ago, a metallic flavor had taken up residence in her mouth. No amount of saltwater rinsing could dislodge it. Her fingertips had gone numb, bloodless and pale despite the morning's warmth seeping through the windows. She placed the tray on the bureau and crossed to the bed where the figure lay in exactly the position she'd occupied yesterday, and the day before that, hands arranged on the coverlet, eyes sealed, breathing so faint it barely disturbed her chest. Ruth pressed her palm against the shoulder, beneath the heavy flannel nightgown. The eyes opened. They were always shockingly lucid, brighter than Ruth's own vision felt these days, clearer than seemed possible for someone balanced on death's threshold. She fed her mother-in-law the way she fed the children, same mechanical rhythm, same understanding that this was simply what the hours demanded. Spoon to lips, pause for the swallow, spoon to lips again. The eggs disappeared, the toast followed. The milk the old woman drank without assistance, Ruth's hand cradling the base of her skull, tipping the glass at the necessary angle. When nothing remained, Ruth eased the white head back onto the pillow and descended the stairs, tray in hand. Thomas sat rigid at the kitchen table, both palms flattened against the surface, as though gravity itself might betray him without that anchor. His breakfast lay untouched. Ruth didn't need to glance at his plate to confirm this. 12 years of marriage had taught her to decode the language of his posture the way farmers read cloud formations. She poured coffee and settled across from him. Her own meal waited, eggs, toast, a pat of butter slowly liquefying. Hunger had abandoned her. The metallic tang coating her mouth had intensified overnight, bitter as oxidized copper. Still, she lifted her fork. Eating had become another task on the list, like climbing stairs, scattering feed, folding sheets. Motion divorced from desire. Thomas finally reached for his utensil. They chewed in oppressive silence. The children had already departed for the schoolhouse, their 2-mile trek begun hours ago. The kitchen's emptiness felt ominous, like the suspended moment between the flash and the crash. 3 bites in, Thomas abandoned his fork. His complexion had drained to ash. Ruth felt her own abdomen contract in response, the same vicious cramping that had been ambushing her for weeks, occasionally violent enough to double her over the wash basin. She watched his throat convulse, watched him fight down whatever threatened to rise. He pushed back from the table without a word and disappeared toward the barn. Ruth remained alone with congealing eggs turning cold on porcelain. She should be washing dishes, should be starting the laundry, should be checking on the old woman again, though she'd left that room mere minutes ago, and nothing would have transformed in the interval. Nothing ever transformed in that room, except the sun's slow migration across the floorboards. Instead, she pressed her palm against her midsection, feeling the persistent gnawing sensation beneath her ribs, something eating away from within. Her thoughts turned to the well. They'd drawn from it exclusively for as long as she could remember, even during the brutal drought years when neighboring wells turned to dust. Theirs had never surrendered. Thomas's father had excavated it himself 4 decades prior, lined the shaft with creek stones hauled one by one, declared it the finest water source in the county. But Ruth had seen articles in the newspaper, stories about wells contaminated by underground minerals, families sickened by the very source meant to sustain them, arsenic seeping upward through soil like a malevolent force rising from below. She crossed to the sink and worked the pump handle until water surged into the basin. It appeared normal, indistinguishable from every other morning's draw. She filled a glass and raised it toward the window light. Transparent, innocent. Her vision wavered, fatigue surely, just exhaustion pressing down. But when she blinked to clear it, the water stain spreading across the ceiling seemed to rotate, seemed to present a different angle, a different face. She blinked again. She blinked once more. The stain remained motionless. She abandoned the glass on the counter and climbed back upstairs. The old woman hadn't shifted a millimeter. Ruth located her wrist, counted the pulse against her watch face, recorded the time and rate in the narrow ledger kept atop the bureau. Heartbeat consistent, respiration unaltered. The grandmother remained fixed as marble. Ruth straightened the blanket, adjusted the curtain's drape, lifted the chamber pot to carry it down. As she raised it, something registered at the edge of her awareness. Lavender. The faintest trace of lavender soap, the kind they stored beside the kitchen pump. Peculiar. The grandmother had demanded unscented lye exclusively for years. Her skin couldn't tolerate fragrances, had rejected them since before Ruth entered this family. Ruth froze, turning the detail over mentally, then pushed it aside. Scent must have traveled upward somehow. The mechanics of care had become so ingrained she could execute them while her mind wandered elsewhere entirely, to the ache radiating through her gut, to the ashen pallor overtaking her husband's features, to the untouched glass waiting on the counter below. That evening, Thomas entered their bedroom well past midnight, carrying the odor of hay and livestock and something else, something acrid. Ruth remained motionless, feigning sleep, tracking the sound of him shedding clothing in darkness. When he finally lowered himself onto the mattress, it sagged beneath his weight, and his breathing came rapid and irregular. She kept her eyelids sealed. The house voiced its usual complaints around them: timber contracting, drafts probing seams, familiar nocturnal sounds she'd absorbed across 12 years of residency. But tonight, she found herself interpreting them differently. That groan from the corridor, settling wood or measured footfall. That whisper from the ground floor, wind or hinges. She scolded herself for paranoia. The old woman couldn't ambulate. The physician had declared her lower limbs defunct, musculature atrophied from 2 years of immobility, the neural pathways themselves destroyed beyond restoration. But the physician was Dr. Brennan, who delivered Thomas 4 decades earlier and now only appeared when specifically requested, who diagnosed primarily through verbal inquiry and superficial observation. His last ascent of these stairs, 3 months past, had yielded a verdict of stable deterioration, chronic condition, not worth the expense of regular monitoring. He checked her pulse, noted her respiration, instructed them to maintain her comfort. He hadn't asked her to demonstrate leg movement, hadn't assessed her reflexes, had simply touched her wrist, inclined his ear toward her chest, and departed. The old woman could scarcely elevate her skull from the pillow. Yet this morning, while sweeping the kitchen floor, Ruth had discovered a long white strand near the icebox. She'd stooped to collect it, intending disposal, but instead stood frozen with the hair pinched between thumb and forefinger, attempting to reconstruct how it could have migrated there. The grandmother's. The bedroom existed on the second floor. The old woman never descended. Ruth had collected the strand without a second thought at the time. But now, suspended in darkness, the memory resurfaced with crushing significance. Ruth's eyes snapped open. Beside her, Thomas's breathing had fractured into something jagged, wet. She realized with sudden clarity that he was weeping. In 12 years of marriage, she'd never heard him produce that sound. Instinct drove her hand toward his shoulder. The moment she made contact, he recoiled with such violence the bed frame slammed the wall. Dawn hadn't yet broken when Ruth woke to agony tearing through her abdomen. She had to clench her jaw until her teeth ached to suppress the scream building in her throat. She barely reached the chamber pot before her body expelled everything, convulsing until nothing remained, until she was trembling and drenched in cold perspiration, and wondering if this was the shape death took when it arrived. The metallic flavor flooded her mouth with renewed intensity. Her extremities had gone dead, a creeping numbness ascending from fingers and toes like ice climbing her limbs. Thomas slept through it, or performed sleep convincingly enough. When she finally crawled back beneath the covers, the horizon had begun to light. Sleep wouldn't return. She lay observing the ceiling materialize in gradual illumination, studying the water stain in the corner that resembled a human profile. Watching, thinking about the well, about toxins buried in soil, about invisible agents destroying them so gradually they couldn't recognize the assault until surrender became inevitable. At breakfast, she made the declaration. No more well water. They'd purchase it from town instead. Have it delivered in containers. Use it for all consumption and preparation until the well could be properly analyzed. Thomas's eyes met hers across the table, coffee cup suspended midway to his mouth. Relief crashed across his features with such totality she understood immediately. He'd harbored the identical suspicion, had been terrified to voice it because articulation would transform theory into undeniable reality. They devoted the morning to elimination. The fresh milk went down the drain, the coffee pot empty, every vessel and pitcher carried outside and overturned in the yard. Ruth watched the liquid disappear into compact earth and calculated all the water they'd consumed, the coffee and tea and cream-thickened desserts, the broths and stews, weeks accumulating into months, and wondered if intervention had arrived too late, if the contamination already permeated them, threading through circulation and tissue and marrow. Thomas labored alongside her in total silence, movements rigid and controlled, like someone anticipating bodily betrayal at any moment. When he hoisted the wash basin for disposal, his grip faltered so severely water cascaded over the rim. Ruth averted her gaze. Let him preserve that fragment of dignity. They were both performing now, maintaining elaborate fictions to survive the morning, pretending they were. They were actors now, performing calm, treating this as sensible caution rather than what it truly was, a frantic clutch at continued existence, acting as though abandoning the well would actually alter their trajectory. By midday, the house felt gutted. Every familiar container that had cradled their daily water, the pitcher beside the stove, the basin in the washroom, the jug stationed on the bedroom dresser, stood vacant and parched. The emptiness carried the weight of bereavement. The delivery arrived late afternoon. A stranger from town Ruth recognized only vaguely hauled 4 massive jugs across the threshold and positioned them in the kitchen. He was young, vital, his complexion flushed with robust health. Ruth couldn't stop studying him, the steadiness of his grip, the clarity in his gaze, attempting to excavate the memory of wellness from her own deteriorating frame. He seemed to exist in an entirely separate taxonomy of being. After his departure, the house contracted around them, more isolated, more suffocating. Ruth deployed the purchased water for everything, boiling vegetables, brewing coffee, filling drinking glasses at the evening meal. She even used it to replenish the pitcher in the grandmother's quarters, though the old woman consumed so negligibly it felt almost performative. That night Ruth lay rigid beneath the covers, waiting for relief, waiting for the abdominal torment to recede, for the fog to lift from her thoughts, for the trembling in her fingers to cease. Morning arrived with intensified agony. The pain had migrated from her core into her joints, a profound bone-deep ache that locked her knees when she attempted to rise. Downstairs, Thomas hunched over the table, skull cradled in his palms. His meal remained pristine, untouched. The coffee she prepared with the new supply sat cooling, abandoned. Something arctic moved through her ribcage. They'd eliminated the well water, followed every logical precaution, done everything conceivably correct. And they were degenerating faster. Thomas raised his face toward her, and what she encountered in his expression made her retreat a step. His focus had softened, gone vague. His complexion had acquired a jaundiced tint she either hadn't registered before or had deliberately ignored. His mouth opened as though to form words, then closed without sound. The quiet between them became tangible, physical, something you could stumble over. Ruth compelled her body into motion, crossed to the stove, cracked eggs into the heated pan despite her gut's violent protest at the aroma. Routine was her final anchor. If she abandoned the cooking, the cleaning, the ritual climb with the breakfast tray, what remained? Only the suffering, the dread, the absolute conviction that something was systematically destroying them and they possessed no name for it. The eggs sizzled. She observed the whites solidifying at the perimeter, watched the yolks quiver under applied heat. Behind her, Thomas's chair grated across floorboards. She registered him standing, heard his irregular footfalls approaching. When his palm settled on her shoulder, she jerked involuntarily. He withdrew. His palm lifted away instantly. They remained frozen, separated by inches that felt like miles, while the eggs continued their transformation in the heat. Ruth cataloged the years of meals prepared in this exact space, the countless mornings seated at this table, the mundane exchanges about climate patterns, harvest yields, supplies the children required for lessons. That existence felt distant now, remote as a story absorbed from someone else's diary rather than lived through her own flesh. She transferred the eggs to plates, positioned them on the table, lowered herself into the chair opposite her husband. They attempted to eat. Thomas managed 3 forkfuls before the utensil clattered against porcelain. Ruth observed his hands compress against his midsection, watched his esophagus struggle against ascending nausea, witnessed him lurch from his seat and stagger toward the exit. She remained alone with half-consumed food growing cold. The kitchen settled into profound stillness. The mantel clock's rhythm penetrated from the front room. Her own respiration, cautious, measured, filled her ears. And from above, barely audible, bed springs groaning. Perhaps the grandmother adjusting position during rest, or perhaps the grandmother listening. The day dissolved into haze. Ruth executed her duties like an automaton, ascending with the breakfast service, spooning eggs and toast into the old woman's compliant mouth, angling the milk glass against her lips. The grandmother's gaze remained crystalline as ever. Her pulse maintained its unwavering tempo. Ruth found her attention fixed on her mother-in-law's serene expression, on the way those hands rested, perfectly arranged atop the coverlet. Something corrosive and illogical climbed her throat. This woman contributed nothing. lay motionless while Ruth scoured floors, wrung sodden fabric, climbed these stairs 3 times daily, bearing meals the recipient barely consumed. While Ruth and Thomas approached their end, and they were approaching it, she could sense dissolution in her marrow. The grandmother persisted, unchanged, stable, identical to yesterday, to the day preceding, to every day spanning 2 years. Ruth deposited the emptied tray with excessive force. China rattled against itself. The grandmother's eyelids lifted slowly. Her focus settled on Ruth's face. They regarded each other across a lengthening silence. Ruth wanted to speak, wanted to demand answers, but language failed her. What question could she even articulate? Why does illness spare you? Why do we deteriorate while you endure? Why do you continue existing at all? Shame flooded her immediately. This was Thomas's mother, a defenseless woman stripped of autonomy. Someone who'd nurtured Thomas through childhood, who'd received Ruth into this household without reservation, who'd cradled Ruth's infants when they first entered the world. Ruth pressed. Her skull felt like it was splitting. Ruth pressed her fingertips hard against her temples, trying to force the fury back down, the suspicion clawing at her thoughts. Symptoms, she told herself. Just more symptoms of whatever invisible thing was devouring them from the inside. She descended with the tray, hands betraying her with every step. In the kitchen, Thomas stood motionless at the sink, staring, not at the basin, at the pump handle like it might lunge at him. He hadn't washed, hadn't changed. When he finally rotated toward her, his eyes had taken on a glassy sheen, fever bright, wrong. The children burst through the door that afternoon with the chaotic energy of the uninfected. Ruth served them dinner, potatoes and beans prepared in the purchased water, and studied them while they ate, searching for tremors, for pallor, for the first signs of collapse. Nothing. They talked over each other about the spelling competition, about the newborn livestock at the adjacent property, about trivial childhood dramas that felt imported from another dimension. They occupied a reality Ruth and Thomas no longer had access to, a place where water didn't carry death, where digestion didn't feel like warfare, where hands obeyed commands. After the children disappeared upstairs, Ruth and Thomas faced each other across the kitchen table. The lamp flame wavered between them, throwing distorted shadows. The coffee she poured sat cooling, untouched by either of them. Time had started behaving strangely. Ruth kept surfacing from fugue states, discovering herself staring into the lamplight with no recollection of the minutes that had evaporated. Thomas broke the silence. His voice emerged shredded, barely audible. Ruth had to incline forward to capture the words. He'd solved it, he said, figured out the pattern. The well water was innocent. They'd consumed it for years without incident. His parents before them, decades without contamination, and the new supply was equally harmless. The water wasn't the problem. It was the food, something embedded in the meals, something someone was introducing deliberately. His gaze locked onto hers when he said it, the first direct eye contact in days. The accusation suspended itself in the air between them, heavy and unmistakable. Ruth absorbed it, felt it settle in her chest like lead. Her husband, the man who'd vowed fidelity until death severed them, was suggesting she was the architect of their destruction. She should have ignited with rage, should have felt betrayal sear through her, indignation, heartbreak. Instead, a more insidious sensation took root. Doubt, because if poison saturated their food and her hands weren't delivering it, whose were? The children lacked the capacity, the knowledge, the access. Thomas himself, Could he be contaminating them both? His cognition so eroded by toxicity that he'd lost track of his own actions, fragmenting under the assault, now projecting blame onto her. Or was there a third presence in this household they'd been systematically overlooking? Ruth shot upright. Her chair toppled backward, crashing against the floor with violent finality. The sound detonated through the kitchen's oppressive quiet. Thomas remained frozen, watching her with those fever-glazed eyes that no longer seemed entirely his. The room lurched sideways, walls warping. Ruth wanted to unleash everything screaming inside her, wanted to flee the house entirely. Instead, she turned, left the kitchen, climbed toward the grandmother's quarters. The old woman was conscious. This never happened, not at this hour. Typically, she'd already surrendered to sleep, her respiration so faint it barely disturbed the air around her. But tonight, her eyes were wide, fixed on the plaster overhead. When Ruth crossed the threshold, the head rotated. Smoothly, fluidly, with an ease that violated every medical assessment she'd been given about this woman's condition. Ruth's body locked in the doorframe. Their gazes collided. Something transmitted between them in that suspended moment. Recognition, maybe, or challenge, or some wordless understanding Ruth's conscious mind couldn't process. Then the eyelids descended. The skull resettled against the pillow, and she became once again the immobilized patient who hadn't demonstrated voluntary movement in 2 years. Ruth retreated. Her hands convulsed so violently she had to clutch the banister to navigate the descent without falling. Thomas had vanished from the kitchen. She could track his movements overhead, the groan of floorboards as he paced their bedroom in irregular circuits. She stood alone in the vacant kitchen, attempting to force coherent thought through the mental static overwhelming her. The food. Thomas believed she was contaminating the food. But Ruth prepared everything, cooked every dish, plated every serving. If poison saturated their meals, her hands would be the delivery mechanism. And she wasn't doing it. She knew with absolute certainty she wasn't. Which meant Thomas had constructed a false theory. Or Thomas was correct about the contamination, and someone else was the architect. Ruth crossed to the icebox, opened it, stared at the contents as though intense observation might force them to confess. Milk, butter, eggs, remnants from the evening meal, the purchased water in its vessel. Everything appeared exactly as it should. No visible tampering, no obvious abnormalities. She extracted the milk container and transported it to the table, positioned it beneath the lamp's illumination, and scrutinized it from multiple angles. The liquid appeared unremarkable, opaque white, properly viscous, fresh. She unscrewed the closure and inhaled. Smelled like milk, nothing detectably wrong. But what did rat poison smell like? How much would be required to induce chronic illness without triggering immediate death? To keep victims weakened, disoriented, cognitively impaired. The newspaper article surfaced in her memory. Poisoners operated incrementally, maintained their targets in deteriorating states for months, sometimes years. The symptoms mimicked organic disease. By the time suspicion emerged, intervention came too late. Ruth replaced the cap with. Her grip on the milk container steady. The trembling had ceased. Terror was transmuting into something glacial, surgical. If contamination was occurring, access was required. Someone had to enter this kitchen unobserved, open the icebox, introduce something into the milk, the butter, Her thoughts seized. When was this kitchen ever truly unwatched? Daylight hours, Ruth occupied this space constantly. Evenings, she and Thomas shared the territory. The only window of total vacancy occurred after the household retired, after darkness claimed the rooms and consciousness surrendered to sleep. Unless it was happening then, unless someone descended through the silent house after midnight, someone who'd memorized which boards announced themselves under weight, which hinges protested, someone who could navigate this architecture blind. But who? The children slept like stones. Thomas occupied the bed beside her. She'd register his absence. She'd know if he... Footsteps on the stairs, heavy, arrhythmic, like balance had become a negotiation rather than an instinct. Ruth released the milk container and pivoted toward the doorway. Thomas materialized, one palm braced against the frame for stability. In his other hand, the kitchen knife. Lamplight skated across the blade's edge, transforming it into a line of liquid silver. Ruth observed the light's movement along the metal and felt her internal systems shut down. Absolute stillness. This wasn't her husband, not anymore. This was something else inhabiting his architecture, something corroded by illness and desperation, and capable of violence she couldn't have previously imagined. The Thomas she'd married would never have armed himself, would never be examining her with eyes that registered threat instead of partnership. He wasn't looking at the weapon. His focus remained locked on her, face slack, eyes glassy and unfocused. He resembled a corpse animated by forces that defied natural law, already dead but somehow vertical. He advanced one step into the kitchen. The knife dangled at his side, almost an afterthought. Ruth remained frozen, paralyzed not by choice but by the complete betrayal of her voluntary systems. Her mind screamed strategy, words that might penetrate the contamination clouding his cognition, phrases that could resurrect the man buried beneath the poison. But her throat had collapsed, sealed itself against sound. She considered flight. Her legs refused the instruction. The kitchen contracted around them. The space separating them felt simultaneously infinite and non-existent. She could observe his pulse hammering visibly in his neck, could track his fingers alternating between tension and release on the handle, could see him gathering momentum towards some action he hadn't yet fully committed to executing. Ruth's spine met the counter's edge, sharp, unforgiving. Her mind conjured the children in their beds overhead, what they'd discover at sunrise. Their mother sprawled across the floor, their father standing above the aftermath, weapon in hand. That image branded into their consciousness, permanent, inescapable. The blade lifted incrementally. Thomas's jaw worked, struggling to produce language, to articulate whatever justification or apology preceded the act he was constructing toward. But only a guttural sound emerged, agony mixed with something deeper, more ancient. He closed the gap to 3 feet, near enough that the acrid sweet stench of his perspiration invaded her nostrils, close enough to count the jaundiced discoloration in the whites of his eyes, to measure each fractured inhalation. The knife continued its ascent. Ruth's eyelids fell shut. A detonation from the floor above, massive, like furniture collapsing under impossible weight. Then another and another. Thomas's skull snapped toward the ceiling. The blade descended. His mouth gaped wordlessly. More impacts from overhead, rhythmic now, intentional footfalls, heavy footfalls traversing the grandmother's quarters. Thomas wheeled and bolted toward the staircase. Ruth registered his momentum falter, heard him recover, tracked the thunder of his ascent. Every survival instinct commanded her to flee, to barricade herself somewhere, anywhere but here. Instead, she followed. The grandmother's door yawned open. Thomas occupied the threshold, weapon hanging limp, transfixed by what lay beyond. Ruth positioned herself behind him and peered past his shoulder. Vacancy. The bed remained pristine, coverlet unwrinkled, pillow bearing no impression of occupancy. The bureau stood undisturbed in its designated location. The washstand anchored its corner. The rocking chair maintained its vigil beside the window. Everything precisely arranged, except the grandmother had vanished. The window gaped wide. Curtains billowed in the nocturnal air currents. Ruth crossed to the opening and searched the darkness below. The yard extended into shadow, motionless, empty. No fragile elderly woman dragging herself across the earth. No disturbance whatsoever. She rotated back toward the interior. Thomas remained cemented in the doorframe, his gaze fixed on the vacant bed, expression illegible. Terror, perhaps, disorientation, or something language couldn't adequately capture. The knife escaped his grip and struck the floorboards with a metallic clang that made both of them recoil. Then a sound from the lower level. A noise drifted up from below, cabinet door releasing, floorboard protesting, something substantial meeting the table's surface. Thomas registered it. His skull rotated toward the stairwell. His body initiated movement, then collapsed beneath him. His knees surrendered. He struck the floor with sickening force and remained motionless. Ruth dropped beside him. His eyes remained open but focused on nothing. His chest barely registered movement. She located his pulse, thread-thin, erratic, like something caged and panicking. He was expiring, right here on the floor of his mother's abandoned quarters, dying while Ruth's mind blanked on intervention. The sound repeated from the kitchen, measured, methodical, someone occupying that space with purpose. Ruth's gaze traveled from the pristine bed to her husband's failing body to the doorway opening onto darkness. Every nerve system demanded she remain, barricade herself, wait for daylight. Her legs betrayed that logic, carried her toward the descent. She navigated the stairs with glacial care, palms sliding along the banister. Lamplight spilled from the kitchen doorway into the corridor. She could distinguish the table's corner, the chair's silhouette, glass meeting glass in soft percussion. She reached the ground floor, drew oxygen, crossed the threshold. The grandmother stood at the counter, spine toward the entrance, nightgown hanging loose, feet naked against the floor, white hair cascading unbound down her back. The milk container occupied her grip. Ruth observed as she twisted the cap free, reached into her pocket, extracted a small amber vial, removed the cork with her teeth, inverted it above the milk's open mouth. 1 drop, 2, 3, 4, 5. Counted with the identical meticulous attention Ruth had applied to measuring the old woman's heartbeat all these months. She sealed the vial, returned it to concealment, screwed the milk cap back into position, placed the container in the icebox, closed the door with finality. Her movements carried a deliberate slowness, steady though, not the mechanics of someone incapacitated, not entirely fluid either. She braced against the counter when pivoting, favored one limb subtly. Someone who moved nightly, who maintained just enough muscular capacity, who allocated strength the way she allocated poison, drop by calculated drop. Then she completed her rotation. Ruth and the grandmother locked eyes across the kitchen's expanse. The old woman's expression held absolute composure, her gaze razor-sharp, completely lucid. She registered no surprise at Ruth's presence, no indication of being discovered, no trace of fear or remorse. She appeared, Ruth understood with distant clarity, deeply satisfied. The grandmother crossed to the table, drew out a chair, lowered herself with effortless grace. The movements belonged to someone whose body functioned flawlessly, someone who'd never experienced paralysis, someone who'd been navigating this house, walking, standing, operating independently for months, perhaps years, while everyone accepted her fiction of immobility. She arranged her hands atop the table, regarded Ruth with something disturbingly close to affection. Ruth's body refused commands. Speech vanished. Her consciousness struggled to reconcile the evidence before her with the reality she'd inhabited. The woman declared incapable of walking had been walking. The invalid requiring assistance for basic nutrition had been contaminating theirs, administering poison in increments precise enough to maintain illness without triggering death, keeping them debilitated enough to require her presence, confused enough to miss the pattern. Tremors consumed Ruth's frame, arms, legs, her jaw clattered involuntarily. The grandmother observed this deterioration with clinical curiosity, head canted at a slight angle, the way someone might study an insect's final movements. Ruth's voice emerged unrecognizable when she finally managed speech. "Why?" The grandmother's mouth curved upward, gentle, almost maternal. She raised one hand and tapped the adjacent chair in invitation, the gesture you'd extend toward a child being offered refreshments. Ruth's legs carried her forward without conscious authorization. She found herself seated, facing the architect of her family's destruction. The old woman offered no words, simply maintained her position, hands folded, that subtle smile fixed in place. Understanding crystallized. There would be no explanation, no narrative justification, no confession seeking absolution. The grandmother had executed this because she'd chosen to, because capacity equaled permission, because maintaining her family in states of dependency and weakness generated power she'd refused to relinquish. Upstairs, Thomas had likely expired by now, or hovered at the threshold. The children remained unconscious in their quarters, untainted because they served functions, could transport meals, empty waste receptacles, accept fabricated narratives without question. But Ruth and Thomas had aged beyond usefulness, possessed enough autonomy to consider institutional placement for the grandmother, capable of household decisions that excluded her influence. So she'd engineered their illness, sustained it, would perpetuate it until biological systems surrendered completely. Then she'd redirect her attention to the children, gradually, across years, cultivating dependence, constructing the belief that survival without her was impossible. Ruth's peripheral vision had started dissolving, edges softening into gray static. The poison, she understood with detached clarity, accumulated across weeks of microscopic doses, saturation reaching critical. She would expire here, tonight. This kitchen would be her final location. The grandmother would relocate her corpse upstairs, arrange it convincingly in the bed. At sunrise, summon the children to witness the tragedy, perform grief with theatrical precision, the helpless invalid discovering the devastating loss, while Ruth and Thomas occupied coffins, The property would transfer to offspring still malleable enough to manipulate. The grandmother rose, crossed to the icebox, retrieved the milk container, positioned it at the table's center between them, proceeded to the cabinet, selected a glass, pristine, transparent vacant, placed it before Ruth and initiated pouring, steady stream, unhurried, until the vessel reached capacity. Then slid it forward. Ruth studied the liquid, opaque white, properly viscous, appearing fresh and harmless, lethal. The grandmother resettled herself, hands resuming their folded configuration, waiting. Her expression radiated benevolence, almost warmth. She resembled the archetype, white-crowned, soft-featured, emanating gentleness. The woman who'd nurtured Thomas through childhood, who'd received Ruth into this household 12 years prior, who'd cradled Ruth's newborns. But the eyes transmitted something entirely different, keen, glacial, infinitely patient, the gaze of something capable of eternal waiting, that had already invested years motionless in that upstairs bed, that would invest years more if circumstances required, to claim what it desired. Ruth's fingers closed around the glass, the trembling intensified. Milk crested the rim, pooled across the table's surface. The grandmother maintained absolute stillness, silent, observing, calculating whether Ruth would consume it, whether she'd select swift termination over protracted deterioration, waiting with that terrible, inhuman patience that had sustained her deception for 2 years. Ruth elevated the glass toward her mouth. The milk carried its typical aroma, sweet, unremarkable, exactly as milk should smell. Thomas expiring in the room above filled her thoughts, her children unconscious in their beds, the years extending forward like a nightmare refusing to end, the grandmother's soft tyranny, perpetual illness, corrosive suspicion, death arriving in increments. The liquid met her lips, cold, wet. She didn't swallow. She lowered the glass, stood. Her legs threatened collapse but somehow supported her weight. The grandmother's face remained unchanged. As Ruth pivoted toward the staircase, the old woman's voice emerged, gentle, almost tender. "Don't forget to secure the henhouse." Ruth turned to ice. The words carried such crushing normalcy, such domestic mundanity, so utterly routine. The grandmother was already projecting beyond Ruth's death, already organizing tomorrow's tasks. The children would require meals. The livestock would need attention. The machinery of daily existence would perpetuate without interruption, simply minus Ruth and Thomas. Ruth advanced toward the stairs. The grandmother remained seated, hands arranged, watching Ruth ascend, each step a negotiation with her failing body, toward the bedrooms containing her sleeping children and her dying husband. Behind her, the grandmother maintained her position at the table. Ruth could feel those sharp, frozen eyes tracking her retreat, tracking her ascent through the corridor to the threshold where Thomas lay collapsed and motionless. She registered that surveillance even after physical sight became impossible, felt it like fingers grazing her nape, like atmospheric pressure increasing, like an oath spoken in darkness. The grandmother wasn't departing, would occupy this house at sunrise, and the sunrise following, and every sunrise extending into infinity, would persist beyond Ruth's expiration, beyond the children's maturation, until no living memory remained of anything except the fiction she'd constructed. Ruth collapsed beside her husband, located his pulse point. The rhythm persisted barely, a whisper of circulation, fatting. Summoning the physician crossed her mind. Her body would surrender before she covered half the distance to town. Waking the children seemed equally futile. What narrative could she offer? They'd reject it outright. The grandmother had counter-explanations prepared, would redirect their loyalty, poison them against their own mother the way she'd turned Thomas against Ruth. The milk glass waited below, the grandmother seated beside it, that inhuman, bottomless patience that could outlast mortality itself. Ruth lowered herself onto the floor adjacent to Thomas. His respiration emerged ragged, fragmenting. Her own cardiac rhythm accelerated beyond sustainability, the toxin advancing through her circulation. Below, sounds of the grandmother restoring order, milk returned to refrigeration, glass being cleansed, evidence erased, water streaming from the pump, glass dried and shelved, icebox sealed. Then footfalls, measured, unwavering, approaching the staircase. Ruth's eyelids descended. Beside her, Thomas's breathing ceased entirely. The footsteps reached the base of the stairs, began their climb. Ruth counted them the way she'd counted heartbeats, the way she'd tallied poison droplets, the way she'd measured every day imprisoned in this household. 1, 2, 3. The footsteps crested the landing, halted outside the doorway. Ruth maintained her stillness, eyes sealed, waiting. Something shifted in the threshold's frame. Someone observing her, observing Thomas, observing both of them collapsed on the floor of this vacant room that had contained nothing except fabrications. The footsteps retreated, proceeded down the corridor, entered the grandmother's quarters, the door sealed shut. Ruth's eyes opened. The plaster overhead remained unchanged from 12 years of morning observations. The water damage in the corner still resembled a human profile. The hairline fractures she'd memorized with the same intimacy she knew her own palm's geography. The sounds of the grandmother settling filtered through walls, bedframe protesting under redistributed weight. Or perhaps Ruth imagined she could distinguish those details. The old woman repositioning herself on the mattress, drawing the coverlet upward, arranging her hands atop her sternum, reconstructing the paralyzed invalid incapable of locomotion, unable to nourish herself, requiring perpetual care and protection and containment within these walls indefinitely. At sunrise, Ruth understood the grandmother would produce anguished cries, summon assistance. When help arrived, she'd occupy her bed in the familiar configuration. Ruth and Thomas would be discovered expired on her floor. Who could definitively explain the circumstances? Who possessed evidence? The physician would offer condolences while theorizing about contaminated wells or spoiled provisions, or the fevers that occasionally decimated entire isolated households. The grandmother would demonstrate extraordinary courage through bereavement, would require the children's presence for care, would need them with devastating urgency. Ruth's peripheral vision collapsed into encroaching shadow. Her cardiac rhythm decelerated. Her children waking to discover their parents' bodies consumed her thoughts, growing to adulthood in this structure under the grandmother's supervision, consuming milk from the icebox, ingesting meals prepared by those patient, merciless hands, deteriorating gradually, precisely, just enough to ensure dependence. Darkness advanced from all directions. Ruth's final conscious awareness fixed on the milk glass positioned on the table below. Cleansed now, vacant now, waiting for dawn when it would be filled again.